Thank you, Paula. Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here tonight. I'd like to open with a brief piece of what is a kind of prayer that's been given many attributions, all the way from India to Portugal to Mexico. Don't really know where it comes from, but here's some words called the Prayer of the Woods. I am the heat of your hearth on the cold winter nights, the friendly shade screening you from the summer sun, and my fruits are refreshing draughts, quenching your thirst as you journey on. I'm the beam that holds your house, the board of your table, the bed on which you lie, and the timber that builds your boat. I am the handle of your hoe, the door of your homestead, the wood of your cradle, and the shell of your coffin. I am the bread of kindness and the flower of beauty. You who pass by, listen to my prayer. Harm me not. And we've all seen some harm done to our beloved trees here in Tucson, and we've also celebrated them a great deal. And so we're really happy to have a couple of folks who have dedicated a lot of time to understanding and taking care of trees. Adam Farrell-Wortman is the Horticultural Director at Tucson Botanical Gardens, and he's been there since, I think about 2017, if I recall correctly. He has over 25 years of professional experience building and caring for public gardens and landscapes, including school garden programs and community gardens. And Nazareth has, from the beginning, loved all things green, especially trees, since childhood. Now a certified arborist, she supports the skillful care of trees in the urban environment. She loves to tell people about the benefits of trees and how to take care of these trees so we don't knock them over or scar them here in our desert city. I think the way we'll begin is that Adam will give us just a nice outline of some of the wonderful benefits of trees, some that will be very familiar, some that may be refreshingly new. And then Nazareth will mostly talk about, okay, so how do we as human beings take care of our habitat, including our trees and other greenery that grows around them. Does that sound like a good plan? Okay, so Adam, please just let's go and we're all going to listen. And then, as Paula said, put your questions in the chat if you like, or raise your digital hand. I think we've got some alert speakers here who will notice that. And if not, I may mention.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Stuart, and thank you all for having me tonight. It's my pleasure to speak about trees. They're one of the most important facets in what makes the gardens, the Tucson Botanical Gardens, so special. So the Tucson Botanical Gardens has a tree canopy of that creates about 70 to 75% verdant shade in the garden space, which is one of the densest shades in all of Tucson. And I was lucky enough to inherit this canopy, and it's been my responsibility to take care of that canopy and replace and grow it as time goes by. So I took the opportunity when Stuart asked me if I would speak to this group to kind of go back to school a little bit and refresh myself on some of the research being done on trees right now. Um, I would, considering the type of group you all, Sustainable Tucson, I imagine we all are familiar with the properties of trees that can combat climate change. So trees sequester carbon from the atmosphere. And I also imagine that we all understand that trees can help clean our air by taking in that carbon, but also trees can actually take in quite a few pollutants, for better and for worse for the tree, but for our own urban air quality, trees are vitally important for cleaning our air. However, I had some fun going through some of the research articles. A lot of new research coming out on trees is showing that trees have a very important effect on our health, both physical health and emotional health. I was just reading a little summary of an article today uh, where a little science experiment was being done where they were taking people's vitals and they would have them look up through the canopy of a tree for a minute, and then they would have later on they would have that same person look up at a building, a skyscraper, for a minute, and they would tracking their vitals like their blood pressure and their heart rate, and they found that looking up through the canopy of the tree uh, provided positive outcomes to all of their measured all of the measures they were doing on people's vital health. So their blood pressure was dropping and their heart rate was going down and their breathing relaxed. And they actually did cortisol testing and they found that like the levels of that stress hormone cortisol dropped in people's bodies just by spending a minute looking up through the canopy of a tree. Um, it's quite amazing. One of the interesting things about, or one of the hard things I would say politically about trees is that the benefits that we get from trees are come in a long term. Um, and so we get some benefit from a tree when we first plant it, but really the real benefits that we're finding scientifically that we're getting through trees is once they're older and mature. And so that means that that the investment is up front, and then you have to wait a while before you really start to see the impacts. One that was one of the interesting things I was finding in looking through some of the health research on trees was that was that so much of it corresponds with the health for the person um, gain from the tree is actually related to the health of the tree itself sometimes. So there's this really interesting research out saying that, well, trees can definitely lower stress levels and help with lowering feelings of depression when they're healthy trees that we're observing. But when they're unhealthy trees, they can actually have the opposite effect and actually cause anxiety and stress in people by looking at unhealthy trees. Um, anyway, this was some of this was new to me, and I just really wanted to share it with this group. Um, I want to talk specifically about tree canopy in Tucson lowering our temperatures because we're going to be on the verge next week of possibly breaking our our earliest 100-degree temperature day. And if we do break it next week, it'll be by like a month. We'll hit 100 earlier than we've ever hit it before. Tree canopy can lower our urban temperatures, and for me, that's a incredibly important for our community. That verdant shade is different than any other type of shade because the verdant shade not just shade creates cooler temperatures underneath it, but it actually creates cooler temperatures all around it as well. All right. Really feel, are there any questions? Because when I give the talks like these, I love being interrupted by questions. It helps guide my speaking. And although I can talk a lot about trees, I really prefer to talk about uh, or answer questions that things people are interested in, rather than me guessing. Um, but I will talk about our tree health at the garden. Oh yes,
Let me give the first one, Adam. When you say that the people are sad or people feel stressed when they look at unhealthy trees, so it's not that the tree is giving off some toxins because it's broken or something, but like because we walk by snags all, when you're going through the forest, they're not making us feel bad. But you're saying that just seeing it kind of depresses our mood. Is that what they
yes,
found?
yeah. They're finding so one of the interesting things about research with trees and human health is most of it isn't they can't prove direct causal relationships most just because that's very hard in research in general, but very hard when you're talking about things like mood and so anyway, but no, they were finding that unhealthy environment basically, which in the trees is a signal of that, right? So the unhealthy environment can actually denigrate your mood quite a bit. And so that unhealthy tree can actually make you feel sad, which is actually it just makes a lot of sense intuitively, I think. But the fact that they could really find that in their research, I found fascinating.
I can
Um,
re I can relate to that in as much as there's someone's pine tree a block away was, for whatever reason, was starting to turn a little bit brown, a little bit of brown, a little bit brown. Suddenly, it's just the whole thing is brown, and I definitely feel sad when I look at that. Um, so I can imagine then that could be a universal response for those who love trees.
Yeah, well, I think part of it is, yeah, that we feel a connection. Like you said, this is a the pine that you look at. Um, you've built a connection with that, a relationship with that, seeing it every day, and so when you see a living thing suffer, it it's a it's just a very human response to also internalize that suffering. And when you feel see a living thing prosper, it's also a human thing to feel lifted up from seeing that prosperousness. Um, so one of the things at the gardens I've been focusing on is our tree health, and so I've come across quite frequently in Tucson, um, people telling me, "Well, I've planted a native tree, so I don't have to worry about said native tree. It's native to Tucson, and so it'll just grow by itself and do fine." Um, and I have found that, well, obviously that's not really the case because the native tree is native to uh, the wild um, the wild areas of the desert and not native to the urban landscape. And so we've been focusing at the gardens of improving our soils for the trees and really um, targeting tree health to make sure that they're going to be around for the next generation and farther. Um, and I also I want to talk about the aesthetic value. I think it kind of suggested it when we were talking about looking at a tree, and if it's healthy, then then it can actually lift our moods, and if it's unhealthy, it can really depress us. Um, when I started being a gardener and going into horticulture, I was very utilitarian in nature, and I really didn't take into account aesthetic that much. And then as my career progressed and as I got older, I realized our aesthetic life is so important. And um, and I really feel like that's one of the biggest benefits of trees that is easy to overlook is that um, trees bring an aesthetic that cannot be human created, and that aesthetic improves our daily existence, really.
Adam, I think Wanda, you had your hand up. Did you decide the question was?
Well, I didn't want to interrupt him.
Oh,
Go ahead.
So I have two questions. I live on the west side of town, and we were hit by a tornado, which is just sort of unbelievable in Tucson. But I still have one neighbor who hasn't been able to move back into her house. And my greatest damage, I have lots of trees. I live in the desert on about an acre, and I'm fortunate to have a lot of trees. And I had significant damage. I mean, it took me literally a year to clean up all the damage of almost whole Palo Verdes and mesquite trees and some others. And it seemed to me that it was important now that I'm pruning a lot more than I ever did, because I was told that if you prune and you open up the canopy, the wind can get through. But it's when the wind can't get through that it breaks off whole limbs of trees. Have you experienced that, Adam, or do you think that's true?
I think that's a perfect segue into throwing over to Naz, our arborist. Um,
Okay.
but but I do agree with that, and I will say that once at TBG, when my first couple of years, I wasn't the director of horticulture. I was a horticulturalist at the gardens, and I wasn't um, I hadn't fully taken responsibility for all the trees on grounds, and um, and then during that time, because we didn't have an arborist and no one that was really focused on our trees, we had a lot of wind damage on our trees. Every monsoon storm seemed to bring another breakout here. I actually had a tree blow down. Um, and actually after the first tree blew down at the gardens, I said, whoa, um, we really got to bring professional arborists on board and and start really paying attention to our canopy. And actually, that's when I met Naz. So I will kind of kick it over to Naz to answer your question directly.
And as we kick it her way, I have one other. I'm noticing something I've never noticed before, and I've been here for decades, and that's the trees are getting sunburn. I have some olive trees and Palo Verde, and it's blistering the bark. So I'm covering them with black shade cloth, wrapping it around them, but no one professional has told me that that's a good idea. So if you know anything about that, I'd appreciate that too. Now I'll be quiet. Thank you.
I can actually help you out with that as well. Thanks. Yeah, no, always great to have questions. Let's do that first because I got plenty to say about how to take care of trees, but that is a really relevant thing, and I imagine there are similar questions from various people about stuff like that. So, hi, I'm Nazareth. Also, thank you guys for having me. I'm here to talk about how to help trees, which is what I talk about most of the time. Uh, but yeah, so with what you were asking with wind damage and that sun damage, which is one of those, I was asked to discuss what prevalent harm is facing urban trees recently, and that's a big part of that is that tendency to sunscar and these new like prolonged high temperatures and less water. Um, so those are two problems that kind of end up in opposition to each other, dealing with adverse climate conditions. You've got Obviously, like you'd rather have wind to be able to pass through your trees, which I would personally suggest, especially if you're out in the open, just removing dead wood on a regular basis and probably leaving the live tissue. There are things you can do to thin out a canopy of live tissue, but generally speaking, if you take out what's dead, that's probably going to be the best in those circumstances, just off the bat without looking at it. Um, and then the sun scarring is a lot of the time if you have picked up those little shoots from the bottom, if something that was covering the tree isn't covering it anymore, if you've gotten rid of leaf litter, organic matter under the tree, they're going to have more contact with the sun. But some sun scarring is not uncommon nowadays because things are more prone to that when they are lacking in water and we don't get too much rain anymore. Um, Not a bad winter for it so far, which was nice, but yeah, not that is just a new thing that they have to deal with. Which actually is a pretty good segue into what we were gonna discuss anyhow. Um, I'm gonna make an effort to not outspeed myself. I have a tendency to do that. I'll start talking faster and faster. If I start going too fast for it to be palatable to anyone, just drop it in the little chat because that's an unfortunate habit. And I'd rather not do that to anybody who's trying to actually listen. Um, so what I was asked to discuss was problems that are facing urban and also, I mean, within that suburban trees presently, and what can maybe be done about that on like outside of one's own home level. Because like a lot of the time you'd love to help out with trees, but they are personal property or they are city property or there's some kind of contract or there's some sort of something in the way of helping out with stuff. And there are things to be done about that, but that's it's difficult. So a lot of the biggest threat to urban trees on the whole is people. Because especially given that like within our landscape, most things that are willing to even survive a little bit here now are native plant life. They are typically, if they were to actually truly be left alone, they would be fine. But there is no version of doing that in the city functionally. When you plant a tree in city soil, anywhere that's been developed, anywhere that's been built on, that soil has been compacted. All of the nice air and water that could flow through that soil previously is generally speaking no longer able to get there by the time the soil becomes backyard. Um, and that's something that is worth addressing before you plant something, which doesn't always have to be drastic measures. I mean, if you have a bare spot, you can mulch that and throw in some wildflowers for a couple of years and just let that start to break up, and then you'll be able to get further and further into that. And half the time with stuff like that, if you're planting from seed, if you're willing to be patient with that, that can really help with that structure over time. Um, so that's on a personal level. That's all sort of the, go to if you're going granola from the like roots up, that I think a lot of people are pretty aware of that kind of thing. Um, but on a community level, there is, I mean, I'd imagine given the crowd, I am not the only person here who has driven around the city and seen what gets done to our urban trees and just kind of gotten that. Adam was talking about it when you see a tree in really poor health, just that, ooh, that really fun, wonderful feeling of watching something hurt, which is unpleasant. Like when you're there, they have those street island ones that have been absolutely stripped with a couple little pom-poms on the end, or something that has had half of it torn off to stay an interesting amount of clear of some power lines and just not fixed up at all. There's also, times where when you see something that has blown over, you realize it barely had any roots holding it in place anyways, because they were either cut off or it was planted in a tiny little concrete box or something like that. And it's all of that can be, I mean, when you really care enough to, I mean, I'd assume we're all pretty on the same page about caring, given that we're here at Sustainable Tucson meeting discussing our urban plants. It can be really distressing. And it's not hopeless, but I think one of the harder things to convince yourself to do sometimes about that, and really one of the most important things that you can do, is to form relationships with the people who do that. The people who, a lot of the time, you probably find pretty unpalatable and a little bit hard to get along with. Realistically, the thing that you can do about trees in a city where you need consensus to do something about trees is make friends. And it I would love to have more to say about just health and mulch and water, because those are the things that are awesome and feel really good to do. But realistically, with the problems that you face in an urban area, it's people. And there is a lot to that. There's a lot more to be gained than sometimes it feels like it is when you're talking to someone who you're barely speaking the same language at a certain point. Like they just think something should look tidy or something, and it's not necessarily where you're coming from, but learning where that person is coming from is, and like understanding that and learning to speak their language is the best way that you can convince somebody to maybe help you out. To, hey, what if we just left that a little bit greener? Hey, what if we could maybe, instead of taking all of the shoots off the bottom of that tree, what if we just turned them into a nice little bush? Baby steps. And there's a lot of value to be gained from that, and I think a lot of understanding and a lot of community to be built there. So I think if I have one really big overarching suggestion on the whole of that, it's that. Now, I'm assuming, based on how speaking in public usually goes, we have some individual tree health questions, because those I can, if anybody has some of those, I can answer. I can go situation for situation. Anybody got some stuff?
Well, I still was wondering about these trees where I have sunburn. I'm
Mm-hmm.
wrapping black shade cloth around them. Is that
Gotcha.
a good idea or not a good idea?
I would probably swap out shade cloth for burlap as a temporary measure.
Okay.
And in the future, I would let some of that tissue that will be shading them out, most especially in the afternoon, get a little bit longer. Even if you end up losing small portions, it'll keep the central trunk healthier, which is more important for the tree's overall health in the future.
Okay. Thank you.
Let's see. Laura is in the chat, says, I attended the certified arborist training here in Arizona 3 years ago, and they were teaching that thinning a tree, removing live branches to let the wind flow through was an outdated and incorrect approach. The wind will go over and around, be more likely to, except for having dead branches for. Yes. So generally speaking, that's something that overall on the whole has been kind of run through within like the International Society of Arboriculture. Like the idea of just thinning by default is something that we've kind of left behind, but in situations where you're in a large flat plain with trees growing in situations that they maybe wouldn't naturally be growing in, like something that's been picked up, there are times when you do need to remove that density. Although if it's something where it's a larger specimen and it is a big question, and to do that you would have to get out a chainsaw, that is around about the time that you should call an arborist. So
Somewhat in line with what Wanda was talking about and what you've mentioned, we've got trees that some people have planted close to the curb because that's where there was space.
mm,
They wanted it on the front of the property, wanted to shade the street.
mm,
And a lot of the green infrastructure that's being put in right now is that way. I mean, we've got these little bump outs and swales, and a lot of the root is going to be under cement or asphalt. And is that a concern to you?
well, actually the most likely situation is that it's not going to have very many roots. The way that we build sidewalks, the way that we build roads, by necessity, because obviously those things need to last, otherwise they're a safety hazard. The soil is so compact under those things that oftentimes it is very comparable to stone. They will, a lot of the time, if you've seen when trees like blow over out of those during when we get all those microbursts and stuff, you'll see kind of a square shape of roots and then like a couple little thready ones under. Luckily, when it's in like really too small of a space, usually they'll blow over before they blow over dangerously. But with that, I think a lot of the time, if somebody wants greenery in those spaces, as long as you're not around a corner, you're not going to impede visibility. Something like a large shrub that you can shape into something appropriate might be better in that area, and a tree can come further back. But I mean, for the ones that are already there, if they make it, that's usually worth at least trying to keep well. But in a situation like that, it's very, what can we do with the lack of things that we have, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in on that. When we're in the urban environment, that's not the ideal place for a tree, just period. Um, so it is, but just because it's not ideal, I think we're just very pragmatic about it. So I would rather have a bunch of stunted, small trees planted in spaces where they're not going to grow great than this to have those spaces not planted at all. Um, I think, yeah. So it's to some degree a matter of being pragmatic. Now, a lot of times in gardening, we talk about the right plant and right place, and 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 that's how you do things really well. But um, so yeah, so we want to encourage people. Well, it's okay to plant right next to the curb, but maybe not the biggest trees out there. Maybe you want to plant one of the smaller varieties that are native to the desert. But just because it won't be the ideal place for a tree, doesn't mean it's not a good idea to put a tree in.
Yeah, that's a much better way to put that.
And Adam, I think maybe you mentioned this in your article that just having shrubbery around is itself going to be cooling. And I mean, now as you talked about, okay, you can start with wildflowers and get things going, and maybe even they keep being there, and then shrubs. So you're asking us not to be, I don't know what would be the word, tree zealots, but more like tree aficionados in terms of what we choose and where we choose to put it.
Yeah, I mean, the desert I think makes for a great example palette of the question of like, hey, what really is a tree? Because I mean, you've seen the little palos, the little mesquites that are out in the native desert. Like, arguably, that's a bush. It's 5 feet tall. It's a bushes do not provide shade. I think you might be surprised if you've walked by one of those really really big old creosotes in the city. You can get close to that; it'll cool you off for sure, and it'll be nice enough if you're willing to sit down. Um, Besides, it's not just shade for us, shade for the ground, shade for surrounding hardscape. All of that is a big part of that heat island effect that Adam was talking about with trees in the city being actually like something that reduces the temperature overall, not just in the experience of the shade of a tree.
Mm-hmm.
Correct. So a lot of the research on tree island on the heat island effect actually in trees is actually usually done in areas with much broader leaf trees, with much denser shade being provided by the tree. In the desert, our densest shade comes from bushes and ground cover, though obviously we can't lie underneath that shade, but it is shading the ground. And the issue with the heat island is the ground itself, the ground temperature is being raised by direct sunshine. So if if it's a spot that that you're not going to be lying underneath, um, you'll actually get denser shade from a bush than you're going to get from most of our desert trees. And so the cooling effect will actually be um, much stronger from that bush than from a large tree.
Mm. Not only that, I mean the cool from a tree or a plant isn't just the shade that it provides. It's also the respiration going on in the tree. They're funky little outside air conditioners, and they're pretty cool. Also about Mexican fan palms, if you trim them, yeah, they totally use up more water if they're worth. If you're willing to leave them and let them sit and turn into a little ball for all the local birds and wasps to hang out, and they're actually pretty nice. If you've been around the back of the gardens, they've got some that are actually in their nice happy conditions, and it's a much different plant when you let it live.
Hmm. What do you mean? What let it live? What are people doing to the Mexican fan palms?
Um, so the image that we have of a palm tree, that big stick with a tuft on the end, only
Hmm.
happens when you keep taking all those fronds off the bottom. They'll
Hmm.
get Adam, how tall is your guys'? She's on the older side.
Oh, that one is probably about 20 years old.
And was probably like about 10, 12 feet tall, much, much wider than the fan palms that you see in the city that are getting trimmed, and chock full of birds. That thing, that the tree chirps. It's
So,
lovely.
so we're discussing leaving the beard on the palm tree. So,
Yeah.
that is always a subject of much debate. There
Hmm.
are aesthetic reasons why people take that off. There are a few safety reasons for taking it off, but usually those safety reasons start occurring once the tree gets super tall.
Hmm.
Um, but actually, what it's just one of those interesting things that those palms keep getting taller the more you take off the beard. It pushes the growth of the tree taller and taller. If you leave the beard on, the tree stays short and squat. And it does. It creates an incredible habitat for birds and bees and all kinds of insects and bats. Um, and so yeah, those palms are actually very valuable to the ecology, but not so much if they've been shaved.
Once they're in stick form.
Just to comment, I do know of one situation where they force you to trim it. It's the fire codes. I had to trim my palm tree because it was near a house, and
Mm.
even though the house was brick and it had a metal roof, the fire department uh, required me to trim it, and it's unlike everything else. It's you appeal to Superior Court.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Yeah,
not
I
there's no
of
administrative.
all the regulatory bodies that will occasionally tell you to trim something that's not for the head of the tree, we do respect the fire codes. It's individually it feels like a very low risk. The idea of a crown fire in an urban or suburban environment is so dangerous. They are generally in the right about that.
This was 20 feet from anything.
Yeah. I mean, the biggest, so the reason that's just that kind of just an interesting little side tangent. The reason that they're worried about stuff, even when it is farther, is if something can get up into a tree and get higher up, those fires can spread a quarter mile, a half mile away from the actual thing that's on fire. It's one of the biggest problems that they have out in California, and it was a big part of the fire up in Oracle a couple years ago and how it moved through places that like you wouldn't have necessarily expected. They were pretty sparse desert. Totally off of what I had intended to talk about. I just think fire travel and fire ecology is really interesting.
So you're saying that the embers flew from palm trees in Oracle or
Not
whatever.
necessarily palm trees, but
But
but one of the things that makes fire travel farther is when it can trap when something can go from burning along the ground to burning up higher, which
yeah.
usually happens when you have like dead tissue kind of stacked up in a tree. It will have a much farther like radius in which it can travel because it's easier for it to catch the wind. There's not as much in the way.
Hmm. Wow.
Yeah,
Disappointing, but true.
unfortunate, but We respect the fire codes. The HOA we're willing to fight. The fire codes, no.
Looking at going back a little bit, Laura commented about having done 3 years ago the certified arborist training,
Mm,
and at that time they were what they said was that letting the wind flow through was outdated and incorrect. And
mm,
actually, the wind will go over and around
mm.
the tree. Now, a hurricane's a different situation or a tornado, but just curious if either of you have really looked at that analysis.
Yeah, that's all. One, it is another one of those things that runs into a lot of that research was done largely in like the upper Midwest, and Pacific Northwest is usually where like most of the tree research gets done nowadays. And also with wind pruning, generally speaking, we're not worried about normal wind conditions because we are not a place that has high winds really excessively under typical conditions, and we don't get super duper crazy gusting. When people are talking about wind pruning and windworthiness out here, usually they mean in a microburst situation as much as they can.
And wind grooming is your term for pruning in order to keep the tree in good shape
In
under.
order to facilitate specifically airflow.
Mhm.
Sometimes pruning for like usually people the word people use is windworthiness is something that it's like one of those things where if you see something really dense and you know monsoon's about to start, that'll be something that'll end up coming up because
Mm.
something that would survive under normal wind conditions might just make it if it was like a little bit sparser, but that's definitely a case to case and a professional opinion kind of thing, you know?
So the biggest issue we have here are non-native trees with our wind and monsoon, especially the non-native mesquites. The South American mesquites do kind of create an umbrella like canopy that can truly catch wind when not cleaned out properly. Um, but yeah, Naz is correct. We that that's when you appeal to the certified arborist to um, give you the best uh, the best answer for that. But when I mentioned that once we started having the certified arborists come in, we started having a whole lot less storm damage on our trees. That is true because we were cleaning out the dead, yes, but they're making smart cuts um, in terms of shaping the tree based on its natural shape and how that natural shape was being augmented by the unnatural growing conditions of the garden. And then also we also started a feeding program on the trees, which creates stronger tissue that that makes them more resilient in for storms.
Also, to Miss Jana's comment, eucalyptus can drop branches if not thinned out for airflow. That is, eucalyptus do self-prune. That is typically in response to a lack of water over time. Airflow, the they are more expedient to break in high winds than our trees here, but specifically the branch dropping is a question of drought.
Mm. Wow. Thank you. Thanks for catching that. Let's step back for a second. Tanya commented about liking to walk or ride her bike under the sidewalk trees, and who would not want to do that? So, what and bushes do not provide shade, as Adam said. You're not going to lie down on your with your bicycle under the shrubs. So what do we do?
With having sidewalk trees.
I mean, yeah, what kind of policy would be wise for the city to have regarding sidewalk trees?
Generally speaking, when you're talking sidewalk trees in places that are more available for walking and riding your bike, you'll be talking to a local neighborhood, a local HOA, and those a lot of the time are places that you actually can hold some sway, can be like, hey guys, what if we did this? If you especially if you are a regular participant at those things, if you go to meetings with whatever your little smaller local governing body is, a lot of the times that's where you can get on trees. And if you're as long as you're not talking like a main public thoroughfare in terms of the city, oh boy, we're working on it. That's one of the big battles that everyone's been fighting over the course of the past couple of years. It's going better now. We have a city forester. People really care. Everyone's coming together. There's some interesting meetings going on this year about that. But when you're talking smaller residential areas, yeah, I would talk to a local neighborhood association, see if you can push an HOA around a little bit. I'd be a thorn in somebody's side until they plant something.
Part of the sidewalk tree is you accept a certain amount of mortality. There's going to be higher mortality rates in those tight planted spaces as in thoroughfares, and part of it is we convince the city that even if it is higher mortality rate, I'd rather have to replace trees than not have the trees there at all. And B, with a little extra care, you can lessen those mortality rates. So it's a little 2 to 1. Just because you're gonna have higher mortality doesn't mean it shouldn't be planted. It just means you have to expect to need to plant again. It's a long system. When I worked at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, we would plant around 100 or so trees a year just on the campus. A lot of those we planted what we called, jokingly, we called them tree coffins, which are just those like little 6x6 spaces on the sidewalk. Most of those trees that you plant in there are only going to live for 15 to 20 years, which is not the ideal lifespan of a tree. But having to replace that tree every 10 to 20 years was better than not having a tree there at all. And trying to convince the city that that's the case is really important.
It can be really hard to convince people that things don't need to be perfect to be worthwhile. And it's something that everybody runs into with themselves too. But yeah, big part of stuff like that.
I think, Paula, you look like you've been waiting to ask something or say something.
Well, I'll have a question a bit later, but I wanted to point out Leigh Ellen has been patiently waiting in the chat, has a specific tree question.
Let's see.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Did I also have my hand raised? If I did, that was unintentional.
No, it was just in the chat.
Okay. Okay, good.
My apologies. Where?
Yeah, no problem. So my question, and excuse me if this sounds a little disjointed, because I'm driving. And so funny you brought up Mexican fan palm, because I have I have 4 little baby fan palms in my yard that I had a certified arborist help me replant, and they were volunteers from.
Oh, I think we've lost you.
They were volunteers.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, they were volunteers, and I wanted to move them away from the wall between our houses and, into a nicer spot for them. Anyway, that happened. We replanted them in the fall. I think it was in November. and the two that I potted, I put them into pots.
Mm.
All of all the little trees now have their leaves are dry. They're very dry. And in particular, the ones that are in pots. The
Mhm.
ones that are in the ground still have a little green.
Roundabout
I'm
near the base, or
told-
just a few leaves are still green?
No, there's green near the base. Yeah.
Mm.
So basically, my question is, and I was asking my arborist friend about this, but thought I might as well just ask it here on the call also, or in the meeting. You know, are these little trees goners, or can I rescue them? You know, I guess I didn't give them enough water in the early part of the winter.
It sounds like the ones in the pots are gone. Um, once 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 the heart of a palm dries out, it is dead altogether.
Okay.
It sounds like
Okay.
the ones in the ground, if you put a whole ton of work into a very little sprout, you have a theoretically pretty small chance of saving it. So I would maybe, just in terms of your own life and sanity, it might be time to move on from those guys.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that.
Mm.
What's the word? Candid. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I see we have a question from Laura. Could you please comment on removing asphalt or concrete like streets or driveways to plant trees? Other than first creating a basin to plant the range, should you just put your trees and shrubs in the ground, or is it useful to prep the soil, old compact fill in some way? So I'm a soil person. I always prep the soil no matter what I'm planting. So there's a lot of good things you can add to the soil. A lot of the times, I actually really recommend liquid organic fertilizers for our soil in particular. One, because since we don't get a lot of rain, it's hard to actually get dry fertilizers down in the ground. But also, I'm also a little bit lazy, and I'd rather use gravity and water to just do some of the digging for me. So if you can find a liquid organic fertilizer that has some humic acid in it, that will help prep that ground pretty well for that compact old construction dirt kind of ground, that can help start revitalizing that ground, adding compost, even when you're planting native trees, adding compost to the soil that you're burying that root zone, those roots in. That'll help the tree out a lot as well.
Mhm. And if it was very, very old asphalt, very old concrete that got removed, um, regular soil remediation will get you a good bit of mileage. If it was something that was a newer, in the last 20 years installation, that it would be worth it probably to get out the garden tools and try to break that up a little bit, because the more recent you get, the more you have the sort of safety procedures that are going to mandate people really, really deeply compacting soil.
I wonder whether Dan would like to comment about, he mentioned putting the big trees in the back of your house, you know, or in your yard, if you got a yard, if you got the room. And then the shorter trees, the smaller ones would be more in the right of way basin.
Mhm.
That's just a general, I'm seeing nods there from you.
I Great point. I think I think it's a great way to order things if you have the ability to.
And is it Trace or Paula who wants to
Great.
say?
I've got a question that goes to the extreme opposite end of the scale of what we're talking about. Um, I've been working on a whole issue of how we develop a sustainable water supply for Tucson. And part of my strategy involves uh, planting a whole lot of street trees.
Mm.
Um, and so it turns out there's probably enough runoff from your standard residential street to support a, a dozen at least fully grown mesquite trees, giving each over 5,000 gallons a year. The question I have is where to put them, because a lot of neighborhoods, unfortunately, have sidewalks, and therefore there's no place to put them without tearing up something or giving them no room to grow. Uh, what I think is possible is to actually cut the asphalt and remove enough for a chicane, or to uh, have the basin within the right of way. And I'm wondering what you think of the technical feasibility of something like that. Could we actually somehow find the space for a retention basin big enough to support a full-grown mesquite tree?
There is, if you're around, I believe it is off of the corner of near Broadway and Swan. There is a smaller neighborhood if you're coming out of that little plaza that has like the tiki bar and all those things in it. And you leave that to the west. There's a neighborhood that is engineered with the streets surrounding just a very like mildly graded arroyo, and the trees within that basin are so happy, but it is also very clearly something that was a really early infrastructure piece of the neighborhood. And I mean, I have made trees my whole life. I think it would be a great idea that we just don't have asphalt and everybody has an off-roader and there's a billion million trees, and that's my personal ideal world. um, most of those things are usually physically feasible within, the general bounds of what it takes to move anything in a CD. Like it's not much harder to do a tree than it is to do any modification of a sidewalk. It's usually a whole lot easier than it is to run any kind of pipe. It is a question of people and what they want and what they'll agree to. But in terms of just physical feasibility, yeah.
Um, I'll just kind of reiterate, I guess, what I said earlier in that I think when we're talking about those public right-of-way spaces, especially if the environment's already quite built up and we're not going to be ripping it all out, adjusting what we're thinking about in terms of the tree. So a mesquite tree is one of our larger desert trees, and so it's harder to find spaces for those, but we could really lean into some of our other smaller native trees. I especially thinking of the Palo Blanco recently. I guess it might be just because I'm kind of in love with them at the moment, and I have some design ideas for them that I wish I could see in Tucson, where I would love to see. I would love to see of a bank stretching out of Palo Blancos planted um, every like two deep, going across a whole roadside would just be absolutely gorgeous. But really, it's just a smaller tree, so we could get more of those in these tighter spots, and so then we would be getting more trees into the city. So anyway, so I would just say that, yeah, adjusting what we want for the reality of the space will probably get us more trees in the ground.
That's a much more practical answer.
Well, thank you both. We reached the point of closing, and I'd like to invite each of you just to, if there's any one special point you'd like to repeat. Adam, you kind of did already, but if you want to take a moment to think of what you want us to take home as a result of conversing with you tonight, and then we'll formally close.
Yeah, I think, yeah, that last point I was making, not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good when it comes to the urban landscape and trees particularly. So the good is more trees in the ground, creating more shade and a more verdant environment around us. That's what we want. So if we can't get that perfect, we don't want it to be. We don't want that that idealization to get in the way of accomplishing it. So yeah. So that said, if you don't have room for a huge canopy tree, see if you have room for a little skinny tree, and plant that one instead. And that'll be my takeaway. Thank you so much for having me tonight.
Thank you. Thank you. Naz?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I had to say in this venue altogether was make friends, especially with people who don't already think what you think. That's how we build support, that's how we build community, that's how we get things done. And we do sorely need to be getting things done. So that's, as best as you can. It's not always going to work out, but that's how we can make progress, I think. Thank you also, and thank you for having me as well. This has been lovely.
Yeah, a lot of appreciation, and your comment about making friends reminds me of the book on tyranny, written by a Yale historian who said 20 lessons from the 20th century, and one of the 20 was smile and make eye contact. And so it's like that is itself an anti-tyrannical action, and that's kind of what you're saying there. We're spreading the grassroots of connection, and with that, who knows what great policies and practices might come about. So thank you, everyone. And I think we have a couple of announcements as we close out. Let's find out. Jana usually puts something into the into the chat, and Jana, just speak up if you'd like, or start typing. Jana is our advocacy coordinator. And if you are not already receiving her mailings, she has some really great opportunities at least once a week. Okay, so I think Jana's ready to give us a little more information.
Hi, I'm Janice Siegel-Stormont, and I'm the head of the Water Committee and the Environmental Advocacy email list. Right now, we're doing some request to speak actions of the state legislature. There's been a lot of bills that really put a burden on other government offices and stuff like that. So a lot of overreach and a lot of sprawl, bills about letting sprawl, and which is not good for our water situation. So if you would like to get our emails where we can push back against bad bills of the state legislature, you can email me at jana@sustainabletucson.org. Or if you would like to join the water committee, the last Monday of every month at 7:00, we have a different program on water. The next one, if Catherine Evil Sizer will be doing how she uses rainwater to use everything in her house, in her toilet, to drink. And she'll be talking about how you can use rainwater inside, as well as she has a lot of plants outside that she waters with rainwater too. I think that's March 30th, the last Monday of the month at 7 o'clock. If you want to get a link for that, you can email me again at jana@sustainabletucson.org. And the next one after that will be on, toxins in our water. So look out for that. There's something in the newsletter right now. There's a link, so you can also check that.
Thank you, Jana. And I put your email into the chat too, in case anyone didn't have it. Dan, I'm sorry we didn't get to your question. Let's all take this home. Nazareth, if you have an answer, you want to send that to me. Or maybe, we could take a minute right now. So are there other trees that mostly have a taproot, like moringa? And is moringa a good tree for us to grow here?
So the generally speaking, if a tree is taprooted, that is going to apply mostly in the early years of its life, especially somewhere here where we don't have a very deep soil profile that's permeable to much of anything. But in theory, that should be helpful. The unfortunate thing about it is usually a taproot would be traveling down to find some sort of deeper groundwater, and that would be what encourages that growth. And we don't have the kind of water table to draw that growth right now. It's just not something that is, at least in this valley, like down in Patagonia, you could probably work a little more with that. But right now, Adam,
Yeah.
you got anything about that?
Well, so the question is simply, do we have other trees with tap roots? Yes. So, as Nez was saying, the Arizona cottonwood, the Arizona sycamore, a lot of the very water-hungry trees have large tap roots that go down deep. And those trees are usually growing in an arroyo near a stream bed of some sort. So that taproot is going through a very sandy soil. Whereas, depending on where you are down in the valley, once, as Naz was saying, once that taproot hits the caliche, that caliche tends to stop almost everything from going. But the mesquite also has a taproot. Again, though, just the early part of its life, it has a taproot to really center the tree while it's establishing the other roots that are the lateral roots that are stretching out.
Wow.
I just want to say something about, we did have moringa trees in our right-of-way basin, which was a rainwater harvesting basin. And the issue with it was that there's no protection from other trees or the house. So it froze every year when we had a hard freeze. So now at this point, I don't recommend moringa because I have one of the 4 left that I really baby, because you can eat the leaves and they're really nutritious. But honestly, if you don't have anything to protect it, it's not going to like our cold. Just one day cold freezes the whole tree out. But
Thank you for those comments. Well, thank you, everybody. This has been an enjoyable conversation. Hopefully we all take some good ideas home. And next month we have Bob Vint to talk about design in the desert. How do you make a sustainable architecture that's sensitive to drought, to heat, to wind, etc. And he calls on some ancient architectural principles, and I think on maybe some more recent ones as well. Bob is quite the professor as well as a very handy architect, so we can count on a lot of interesting information from Bob on April 14th, if I've got that date right. Okay, and thank you once again, Adam and Nazareth. Really appreciate your enthusiasm and all the good work you're doing.